Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Hunt, Education and Engagement Leader for the Employer Healthcare and Benefits Congress.
And I'm Amelia Fernandez, the Education and Engagement Leader for the World Medical Tourism Congress.
Thank you for joining us for today's webcast. The webcast is brought to you on behalf of the Employer Healthcare and Benefits Congress and the World Medical Tourism and Global Healthcare Congress. Our webcast today is with our 2014 keynote speaker and best-selling author, Dr. John Izzo. We hope you will join us for both Congress events taking place this fall, September 20th through the 24th in D.C., where you can sit in live on Dr. Izzo's keynote address on leading transformational change, from resistance to results. We are truly excited for our biggest event this fall. Please stay tuned at the end of today's webcast, as well as we'll be sharing 2014 Congress highlights. And as a thank you for attending today's webcast, have special discount codes for you to register. I'd like to begin today's presentation by welcoming our presenter and best-selling author, Dr. John Izzo. Dr. Izzo is the author of the acclaimed books, Awakening Corporate Soul and Value Shifts, The New Work Ethic, and What It Means for Business. He devoted his life and career to helping leaders create workplaces that are capable of bringing out the best in people and helping people discover more purpose and fulfillment in their life and work. He's worked with thousands of leaders, professionals, and frontline colleagues to foster more responsibility, purpose, and spirit at work. You can follow Dr. Izzo on Twitter at John Izzo. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Dr. John Izzo.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and I'd like to welcome all of you who have joined us today. Thanks for giving us a part of your time to talk about what I think will be a really important issue, which is how do we empower people to change their habits. And I remember years ago, Roger Von Eck, who wrote a book called Whack on the Side of the Head, said the only one that likes to change is a wet baby. And, one of the funny things about change is that we talk about it all the time in the workplace, and certainly those of you who are in the well-being or the wellness part of the business know how important it is to try to get people to change their behavior, and yet most of us know very little about how to actually change behavior. So what we're going to do today is really explore this fascinating idea, how do we actually empower people to change their habits? And we will have time for questions at the end, so hold those questions and we'll have a lot of time for some dialogue. As Sarah mentioned, I am the author of 6 books. Began in 1994 when I wrote a book called Awakening Corporate Soul, and was really a pioneer in the whole employee engagement movement. In 2000, I wrote a book called Value Shift about changing employee values and consumer values and what that would mean for organizations. And most recently, wrote my 6th book, Stepping Up, How Taking Responsibility Changes Everything, in which I talked about how do we really take personal accountability and challenge others to take greater accountability. And in many ways, that is one of the challenges for anyone trying to change someone else's behavior, is how do we get other people to take accountability for changing their own behavior. One of the things we're going to discover as we go through our time together today is that, in fact, you cannot change anyone else. Whether you're a leader trying to drive change in the organization or trying to change your spouse or your kids or trying to coach someone at work, what we only can do is really create a situation in which people will choose to change themselves. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So let's begin with really why I'm so fascinated with this idea of changing our behavior. Is that, after working with about 600 organizations all over the world over the last 2.5 decades, I've come to the conclusion that leaders don't want to manage change. What we want to do is drive it. And, we talk a lot about managing change, dealing with change, but for the most part, I think in organizations today, we're much more interested in creating change than just dealing with it or managing it. And certainly in terms of well-being, health, changing people's behavior around some of the things that influence their well-being and their health long-term, we're not interested so much in helping people deal with change as we are in actually getting people to make changes in their life and in their work. And as many of you know, because you've probably studied some of the research, it's not easy for human beings to change our habits. There's research that shows that, it takes upwards of about 90 days for a human being with intense effort to change one specific habit, something like checking our emails less often, which, by the way, is a darn good thing to do because of all the research we're finding on staying focused. But let's begin to ask the question then, what do we know about changing behavior and about getting people to change? Let's begin with some of the emerging neuroscience around changing habits. Now, many of you have probably studied a lot of this research, so I'm going to really be research light here and just make a few really important points. The first one is that as human beings, it turns out we don't actually resist change. What's actually true is we are hardwired for routine, but excited by change. Now, this is a very important, though simple distinction. What I mean by we're hardwired for routine is that our brain, just like the computers most of us are watching this webcast on today, have a large hard drive and a very small working memory. So what that means is that for efficiency, our brain basically puts almost all of our decisions into the unconscious part of the brain for an obvious reason, so the working memory, if you will, can be reserved for the really important decisions. So that means as human beings, we don't only desire routine, but it's very efficient. So we're sort of hardwired to just keep doing whatever we've been doing, and it's not really a bad thing. Any of you ever driven for an hour on a freeway and realized that you weren't paying attention for the last hour because you were distracted and wondered why you didn't die, will kind of realize that the truth is the unconscious brain has an important function. But even though we are hardwired for routine, we're actually excited by change. It turns out that any time a change happens in our environment, we Google something and find a new piece of information, we meet a new person, we travel to a city we haven't been to before, we get a shot of happy chemicals, dopamine and other chemicals in our brain because our brains are excited by change but hardwired for routine. So why this is so important is we have to understand that people don't really resist change. What we resist is the breaking up of routines. We're actually excited by change, but our routines are pretty powerful. The second fascinating piece of research is something that Alvaro Pascual-León at Harvard, a neuroscientist, discovered called the Monday-Friday effect. And to make the research as simple as I can, what they discovered was that when trying to train someone a new skill or change someone's habits, for about a 4-month period, every time you take a rest, let's say I'm learning to play the piano, a simple example, learning to play the guitar, so I'm changing literally physical behaviors, that if you map the brain every Friday, if you take 2 days off, the next Monday your brain pretty much goes back to where it was the week before. So in other words, almost all your learning deteriorates just with 2 or 3 days away from changing your behavior. Until about 4 to 5 months in, when the Monday-Friday effect ceases to be in place and suddenly the new habit has taken over from the old habit. Now what this tells us is that it takes in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 months from a brain perspective before a new habit becomes dominant over the old habit. And we know from research at places like MIT that old habits don't actually die, they're simply replaced with new habits. So, for example, we know that people who have an addiction, whether it's an addiction to food, an addiction to chemicals, that the old habit is literally waiting there to be activated. And one might think that that's probably true with almost every habit that we have, even, again, the simple habit of checking emails frequently. Just try to imagine that path to the habit is sitting there, and all we can really do is replace it with a more powerful new habit that becomes dominant. And it takes about 5 months before, if you will, that old habit is really now subservient to the new one. Moral to the story, by the way, is that we actually have to work longer to change our behavior than we think. So, for example, the average person who quits smoking for good will have tried anywhere from 7 to 12 times to quit before they actually do it. So in other words, this is a good example of how hard it is to change habits, but why grit and the ability to continue to change habits is important. Important practical point around that, as a leader, if I'm driving change and people don't get with the program right away, sometimes I have to be more patient. Second, if we're trying to change people's well-being behavior, understand that, and we'll show later, that we have to actually praise people for the attempt, even if they don't succeed. Now let's think about some important issues around changing behavior. I like what Alvaro Pascual-Leon, a Harvard neuroscientist who I've gotten to know, says. He says, from a brain perspective, every time we do something, we are more likely to do it again. Every time we choose not to do it, we are less likely to do it the next time. In other words, pretty much, again, remember, we're hardwired for routine. So every time we break a habit, we are more likely to break that habit again next time. So in other words, if I go even 2 hours without checking emails to improve my focus and I succeed at it, I will be less likely to check the emails, the next day. If I get one day that I eat in a healthy way, I will be much more likely the next day to eat in a healthy way. So a simple but important idea that even making simple, small choices makes it less likely or more likely that I will do that same or a different behavior the next time. Now, one of the things that we've learned about changing habits is that mindset is an incredibly powerful force. In my book, Stepping Up, I talk about fascinating research by Carol Dweck at Stanford University on the concept of mindset. And what Carol has discovered is that pretty much all of us have one of two mindsets about ourselves. One is what she calls the flexible or growth mindset. The second is what she calls the fixed mindset. And basically what she's discovered is that when we have a mindset about ourselves, it becomes a tremendous shield to us actually changing our behavior. Here's some simple examples. If someone says they are not artistic and believes that, has that mindset about themselves, you can send them to an art class and they still will not learn to be artistic. For years, I had a mindset about myself that I'm not a good networker. And that mindset actually kept me from trying to be a good networker. When I would try and fail, I would say, see, I'm not a good networker. Now, the reason mindset is so important is if we're trying to change someone's behavior or our own, we have to look at the mindset that we have about ourselves. Let me give you a simple example. Any of you who are basketball fans, as I am, know who this guy is, Shaquille O'Neal. You know, one of the greatest basketball players of our generation, MVP a number of times, number of championships. But he had, as many of you know, one Achilles heel. He couldn't shoot foul shots. And no matter how long, he practiced at it, he never got significantly better. In fact, people criticized Shaq, said he didn't practice enough, but his coaches, including Phil Jackson, said that at some point in his career he was literally shooting 200 to 300 free throws a day to try and get free throws better, but he never improved. And fascinatingly, Shaq was interviewed once by Sports Illustrated, and they asked him, of course, as he was asked often, about foul shooting. And what he said is very indicative and supportive of Carol Dweck's research. Shaq said, ever since I was first playing basketball, I had a mindset about myself that I couldn't shoot foul shots. So even when I am in the gym practicing, there's this voice going on in my head saying, Shaq, you can't shoot foul shots. And the funny thing is it really fits so well with what Carol has discovered at Stanford, which is our mindset is a significant predictor of whether we will grow. And let me make this personal for you. If you're trying to change your own behavior, fill in the blank of this question. I am not a people person. I am not an assertive person. I am not a person who exercises. I am not a good networker. And one of the things I challenge people to do is to change that to I am not a good networker yet. I am not a healthy eater yet. And the funny thing is, what Dweck has discovered at Stanford is that simple twist of people beginning to think that other people like myself have moved from being one way to being another way is a very important predictor of whether one will be successful. I suggest if you're trying to change people's behavior that you share that information with people. We find just knowing that our mindset matters is important. Now let's talk about one of the greatest myths about changing behavior, whether it's ours or someone else's, which is the myth that awareness leads to behavior. If people would just realize that smoking is bad for them, that exercise is good for them, that they would be better off, with a certain behavior at work, that somehow this will lead to change. But the fascinating thing is we know that awareness is actually one of the least good predictors of changing behavior. We actually did a series of studies a decade ago and replicated them over several years, where we had people come to a seminar, a full-day seminar, where they identified one or two changes they wanted to make in their life or in their work. And by the end of the day, they had to come up with a change that they were at least a 9 out of 10 motivated to change. Now, you would think an entire day to identify one or two behaviors at most you want to change, and they have to be at least a 9 out of 10, that 3 months later, a significant number of people would have made changes. Now, you might take a guess in your own mind. People leave a one-day seminar identifying one or two changes that are a 9 or 10 motivation for them to change. 3 months later, what percentage of people made any meaningful change in their behavior? And the answer, sadly, is less than 2%. So less than 2 out of every 100 people took a awareness that they said was a 9 out of 10 change for them and made a change. Now, what this says, and we'll get to what we know does drive change, is that awareness without a method for change is almost useless. Now, awareness has to come first, of course. The awareness that I have to be healthier, the awareness that I have to make a change in my behavior at work, the awareness in an organization that we have to change our way of doing business. This is an important first step, but it's actually very insufficient in terms of actually driving behavior. So to kind of maybe make this more colorful for you, let's talk about some fascinating research, very practical research by a guy named Dean Ornish, who I've gotten to know a bit over the last few years. Dean is famous for the work that he has done with cardiac patients. And some of you may have heard the fact that a person who has a cardiac episode, a heart attack, or a significant angina, and they find out they have a blockage, and you do whatever the procedure of the day is, a stent, a bypass, statins, etc., that if one does not change one's behavior in the next 18 to 24 months, there's a very good chance that you will have to have the procedure again or be debilitated or perhaps die. So it's fascinating that only about 15% of people who have a cardiac episode, have the procedure of the day, will actually change their behavior, meaning their exercise, their eating habits, and the way they deal with stress, the three main things that have to change. Only 15% will change over an 18-month period in a sustainable way. Pretty sad if you think about the fact that, in organizations we always tell people, we have to change or we're going to die, which, by the way, I'll tell you later is not a good way to get people motivated. But the interesting thing is change or die, only 15% of people change. Well, Dean Ornish is famous for having literally turned that ratio around, where he demonstrated that he could get 85% of cardiac patients to make sustainable changes in their exercise, their diet, and the way they deal with stress over an 18-month period, and do it sustainably by implementing some very simple changes in how we change people's behavior. So let's look at what Dean Ornish discovered and what it might say about how we actually change habits, and why awareness, meaning simply the awareness that I may die or that I need to change, is enough. So let's think about some things that Dean Ornish discovered. The first thing that Dean Ornish discovered, and I'm going to start there at the bottom rather than at the top, is that he discovered that the toward state is more powerful than the away state when it comes to driving change. So it turns out the more that a doctor talks to people about the fact that they may die, the less likely they are to change. Because fear, it turns out, is a good short-term motivator, but a very debilitating motivator in the long term. And if you think about it, in organizations, we use this fear factor as a major way we try to drive change. I've worked with about 600 companies all over the world. We often talk about the burning platform, and you know, we're on a burning platform. If we don't jump, we're going to die. And yet the interesting thing is the research shows, and Dean Ornish demonstrated this clearly in his, that if he could get people talking about the benefits of making a change in their health, things like I'll be able to walk and do some of the activities that are important to me without being out of breath. I'm going to live to see my grandchildren. I'm going to be able to work longer in my career. I'm going to be able to get off of drugs and save myself money by doing that. That getting people to talk about the benefits of what they wanted to change was a much more powerful predictor of people changing than the fear of death or the fear of the burning platform. And I think you can think of all kinds of ways to apply that in your own life. The second thing is that it turns out social support is incredibly important in terms of creating change. We know, for example, that people who quit smoking are 400% more likely to quit if they are in a support group of some kind, accountable to even just one other person who's also trying to make that change. And one of the things that Dean Ornish demonstrated was that if he got other cardiac patients together who were trying to make significant changes and created a no shame, no blame environment, in other words, where people were not blamed and shamed for the mistakes they made or for falling off the wagon, if you will, but, you know, really praised for the changes that they did make, that people were anywhere from 300 to 400% more likely to make changes. And later, when I share some of our research, you'll find that that when you team support with a couple of other simple interventions, significant difference in terms of changing habits. Now, it also turns out that support matters even more if you're in the wrong gang. And here's what I mean by that. Fascinating research was done by some university professors who wanted to prove that Alcoholics Anonymous didn't work. They were kind of on a mission to demonstrate that AA was no more effective at reducing alcoholism and alcohol addiction than behavioral therapy. But as it turns out, in the largest study ever done to study AA, which their intention or hypothesis was it doesn't work, it turned out they disproved their own hypothesis. But the fascinating thing they discovered was that it turns out that if someone is in the right gang, and what that means if I'm an alcoholic or a problem drinker, I am associating mostly with friends and colleagues who don't drink, who are not drinkers, then one-on-one therapy or going to rehab is just as effective as AA. But it turns out that if I'm in the wrong gang, meaning that I tend to associate with other drinkers or people who are a kind of a drinking culture, then support matters a great deal. Now think about all the ways that this applies. If I'm trying to change a leader's behavior, and they tend to hang out with a lot of other leaders who are a certain way, getting them into an intentional group where they're working with other leaders who are intent on making changes like them, pretty good predictor that they're going to make a change. So it turns out social support matters a lot. The toward state is more powerful than the away state. And the other interesting thing that Dean Ornish discovered is that he discovered that blame and shame gets in the way of people changing their behavior. Let me make it simple what he discovered. He started doing what he called the spectrum diet. Because what Dean Ornish discovered was when we go off our diet, what do we say to ourselves? We usually say, I cheated. I cheated on my diet. What do you feel like when you call yourself a cheat? You feel shamed. You feel diminished. So after, a few days or a few weeks of going off your diet or not doing something you said you intended to do, you build up a great deal of shame. So cognitive dissonance would predict that there's only two ways you can deal with the cognitive dissonance. You either change your behavior, which is difficult, or you give up your goal, which is easier. So most people give up their goal. So instead, Dean Ornish, instead of creating good and bad, created what he called the spectrum diet, which is these are foods that are better for you, these foods that are not as good for you. At any given time, on any given day, you want to be on this side of the spectrum. And if you were not on this side of the spectrum today, let's say you ate the Cheetos when you didn't intend to, instead of beating yourself up, you just say, you know what, today I was on this side of the spectrum, tomorrow I'd like to be on this side. You know, I didn't exercise as much as I liked today, I sat too much. I was here on this side of the spectrum, tomorrow I'd like to be on this side of the spectrum. And it turns out that blame and shame is actually the enemy of change. And later I'll show you some research that will really underline that for you in a powerful way. Now, one of the other interesting things about changing behavior is it turns out that some behaviors are what researchers call keystone habits, meaning if you change one habit, it tends to lead to a constellation of changes, and therefore it becomes kind of where there's a hierarchy of what behavior you would like to change. Let me give you some simple examples. I've done a lot of work with companies over the years on improving their customer service culture. And it turns out that there's one habit that consistently has been demonstrated to raise customer satisfaction in organizations by 70%. Literally, in every industry it's been studied, you can raise your customer satisfaction in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% within 8 to 9 months by one simple thing, which is that every single day leaders make rounds, meaning they go out and walk about, seeing what's happening in terms of customer service, seeing what's happening with staff in terms of delivering service. That one simple habit. And you might ask yourself, why is that such a keystone habit? And if you think about it, it starts to become obvious to you. First, if leaders are out on the floor, it is a hotel, you're out at the in the hotel. If it's an airline, you're out in the lounges, out at the airport. You know, if it's manufacturing, you're out on the manufacturing floor. Because when leaders are out there, what happens? People talk to them. They hear about concerns before they mount up. The leaders start to hear directly and see directly what's working and what's not working. So one way to think about it is that habit seems like only one simple thing, but what it does is it leads to a constellation of other things that tend to happen because I'm out there every day. Now let's take it into the realm of well-being. We know that exercise has been demonstrated to be a keystone habit, meaning when people start to exercise regularly, they also tend to start dealing with stress differently. They tend to start taking care of themselves in a variety of other ways, including how they eat. Whereas changing how you eat does not have the same splinter effect to the constellation of behaviors around well-being that exercise does. Now, the only reason this is important is it really tells us what habits we should focus on in terms of driving change. So if we want to improve customer service, getting leaders to be out there every day with customers and with staff talking about service is a habit likely to change customer service behavior. If I want someone to be more well, exercise, it turns out, is from the research the keystone habit that if you can get someone to start exercising more regularly, and many of you know the most recent exercise shows that, you know, taking that 10,000 steps, the 7-minute workout, just walking regularly, moving, is as important as more vigorous exercise. So it turns out how much or how vigorously we exercise is not nearly as important as that we're active and moving around on a regular basis. So exercise, a keystone habit. So we begin to think about what's a keystone habit that would begin to drive certain behaviors in our organizations. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but for any of you involved in driving organizational change, one of the things we have to really think about is the way in which discipline becomes destiny, meaning the ways in which we hardwire habits in that wind up changing the culture around us. Simple example is at the Ritz-Carlton, where, as many of you know, they have a lineup every single day before every shift in every department where 4 things happen every single day in that lineup meeting. They share a great customer service story from the last 24 hours in their department. They share strategic information about what's happening in the organization and in their hotel. They ask people what's gotten in the way of you delivering great service since the last time we met, and what do we need to do about it. And fourth, they rotate through the Ritz-Carlton key principles for keeping guests delighted and exceeding their expectations. They rotate through those 16 principles every single day. And this is a good example of how discipline becomes destiny. How do we hardwire things into our behavior? And we know that people who, for example, exercise at the same time every day, who meditate in the same place or the same time every day, are much more likely to continue that habit than people who kind of leave it to chance. So again, in the interest of time, I don't have time to go through all of these habits, but another simple one is recognition at every meeting. We found that it's one thing to tell leaders, start recognizing people more. That will, because recognition is good for engagement, it's good for the business. But by simply implementing one simple keystone habit, one discipline, which is that every meeting begins with leaders recognizing people, that simple habit tends to raise recognition scores by anywhere from 20 to 30% in terms of employees' perceptions within a 6-month period, simply by hardwiring in a habit. So again, we have to remember that hardwiring habits and keystone habits, a key way that we change people's behavior. Now, one of the things is that as leaders, we're often and even as parents, we're often in the position of trying to change other people's behavior, coaching them, if you will, to change their behavior. And as I think about this, I think about the research of Michael Pantalone at Yale University, who's done some fascinating research on how we get others to change their behavior. And it turns out that that many of the ways we try to change or coach other people's behavior are counterproductive to actually driving change. Let's talk about some of the interesting things that Pantalone has discovered. The first thing is that people don't get changed, they choose to change. I call it the red button phenomenon. You see, it turns out in universities, if you give people a really challenging, stressful task that they have to work on, they may succeed, they may not. And you say, look, to half the people, you say, look, you have an hour to work on this task. It's going to be stressful. You may accomplish it, you may not. And you have to stay in there for an hour, no matter how stressful it is. There's no way out. The other half of the people are given a red button on the wall and told, we'd like you to stay for an hour to try to accomplish this task, but at any time you want to, you can hit the red button and end the exercise. Now here's the really interesting thing. Ask yourself which of these two groups actually stays working on the stressful task longer, the people who have to be there for an hour or the people who can end the session at any time. And I think you probably know where this is going. It turns out the people who can press the red button are much more likely to stay on task and accomplish it than the people who literally can't leave but have to stay in the room, who often give up even though they can't press a red button to escape. So it turns out we can't change people, we can only encourage them to change. So let's look at some of the fascinating things that Pantalone discovered. One of it is he discovered a series of 6 questions that if you ask people this, you're more likely to get them to change. And I'm going to support this with other research that we've done and research by people like Dean Ornish. First is, it's very important to ask people what they want to change. You see, it turns out when we tell people what we want them to change, it breeds resistance. When, on the other hand, we ask people, what do you want to change, makes a big difference. The second thing is when we give people choices and ask them to make an intelligent decision, rather than us telling them what we think they should do, they're more likely to change. Great example. If a doctor says to a patient, let's say I'm a patient, I go to my physician, and he or she says to me, John, you've got high blood pressure, you're not exercising, your cholesterol's off the charts, you're smoking. If you don't stop doing this, there's a 70% chance that you're going to have a significant health episode or die early. You need to change. It turns out the patient is actually a little less likely to change than before the doctor gave them that information. But if the doctor makes one simple shift and instead says to the patient, you know, John, here's your numbers, here's your cholesterol, here's your blood pressure, etc. Now, here's the situation. If you make no changes in your behavior, there's a 70% likelihood this will happen, 60% likelihood this will happen. If you make moderate changes in your behavior, and it would look something like this. Here's a change in your diet. Here's your change in exercise. Here's how your numbers would change. If you made more radical changes in your behavior and lifestyle, and here's what that would look like, here's how your numbers would change. Now, John, which of these three do you think you'd like to do? It turns out the patient is anywhere from 3 to 4 times more likely to make progress and to choose to change by given options and choices rather than being told what to do. And then here's where Pantalone's research becomes really fascinating. He's discovered that asking people this simple question, how motivated are you on a scale of 1 to 10 to make the change that I've asked you to make or you've decided to make? And let's say someone says 3. You know, a scale of 1 to 10, I'm a 3 motivated. Pantalone says our natural question would be, why didn't you give it a lower number? And if we're honest, that is what we would probably say. But what he's discovered is it's actually the polar opposite of what we do if we want to motivate people. The better question is whether they say 3, 4, 5, why didn't you give it a lower number? And if you think about it, it makes sense. I say to my son, how motivated are you to clean your room? 3. Why didn't you give it a higher number? He says, well, because it's hard to clean your room. All my friends have dirty rooms. I really don't mind the mess, and I really have rather play video games. If I say, on the other hand, why didn't you give it a lower number, he might say things like, well, you know, I'm tired of you riding me. Well, even once in a while, this even drives me crazy. By asking people why they are not more motivated, less motivated, it gets them in touch with their motivation. Finally, he discovered asking people to identify the benefits to them if they made a change rather than telling them the benefits is really important. And finally, what is a next step you are willing to commit to right now? Now, this is very important because it turns out when it comes to changing behavior, getting people to agree to a step they're willing to take, even if it's a very small step, is more important than us getting them to agree to a step that we want them to make that they're not motivated to make. So again, Pantalone's research, pretty fascinating to look at, especially when you're trying to change someone's behavior one-to-one. Bottom line, we can't change others. Number 2, they must choose to change. Number 3, we have to ask them what they want to change, what steps they're willing to take. And when they tell us how motivated they are, we have to try ways to get them in touch with their motivation, not their lack of motivation. And again, going back to Dean Ornish's research, turns out the burning ambition is more important than the burning platform. And again, even in organizational change, ask yourself, how much time do we spend on the benefits of the change and getting people to identify those for themselves rather than all the bad things that are going to happen if we don't make a change? Now, another interesting thing about changing behavior, we'll be getting to questions in just a moment, is this whole idea of behavioral economics, or how do we really create the path of least resistance for people to change? And here's a wonderful little Homer Simpson cartoon where, you know, Apu, the 7-Eleven owner, has put the fruit out there because we know now in cafeterias that if the fruit and the healthy food is more visible and more easily accessible than the stuff that's bad for you, people are more likely to choose it because in essence we have created the path of least resistance. Let me give you an example of how the path of least resistance works and then show you how we might apply it in changing our behavior or others. I always like to tell the story of my friend Steve Pirasante, who is the president of Barrett Kohler, my publisher in San Francisco. And Steve Pirasante is a busy guy. He runs a successful publishing company, but he loves to play basketball. So every Wednesday night he's in a pickup basketball league that happens, you know, adults like himself every Wednesday night. And Steve found for a long time that every Wednesday he'd be ready to go to play basketball and someone would want to have a meeting, there was some deadline, so he kept missing lots of basketball games, which he knew was good for his health and good for his well-being. So finally he made a critical step. He decided to volunteer to be the guy who had the key to the gymnasium and the equipment room. Now suddenly an interesting thing happened. The path of least resistance was now for Steve to go play basketball every week. because now it was harder for him not to play basketball than to play basketball, because now he had to find somebody else to give the key to, find a way to get it to them. So suddenly it's a lot easier to play basketball than not. Sean Acor, who wrote a book called The Happiness Advantage, a friend of mine used to teach at Harvard. Sean talked about when he was trying to exercise every morning, he would actually sleep in his exercise clothes and his exercise socks, put his runners right by the side of his bed, so that when he woke up in the morning, the path of least resistance was to choose to exercise. And we see this in all kinds of ways where how can we make the path of least resistance for ourselves to do the right thing? For example, one habit that I think almost everyone should try to change is how often we check our emails and are distracted by technology. One of the things we've discovered is the simple habit of going to a place to work where you are disconnected from technology and can't reach Wi-Fi, or leaving your smartphone behind and going to a different work area. So in order to check your smartphone, you actually have to go to another room. A simple application of this idea of the path of least resistance. And those of you working on well-being, it turns out these things like where the food is in the cafeteria, how easy it is to get to it, have a big impact on the choices that people make. And part of this is also normalizing doing good. And I'll give you one example of that. We know that if you're trying to get people in hotels, I do a lot of work in the hospitality industry, we know that if you're trying to get people to not, change their towels every day in hotels or change their sheets, that just having that little sign, it's good for the environment, actually doesn't drive very many people to do it. But if instead you simply put a sign in the room saying that 80% of the people who stay in this hotel choose not to have their towels or sheets changed every day, it increases by almost 20% the number of people who choose to do it. If you change that sign to 80% of the people who stay in this room choose not to have their towels or sheets changed, you increase it another 7 to 10%. So in other words, the more we can normalize behavior. So how does that work in change? It means that if we're trying to get people, leaders or people to change their behavior, we regularly feature stories of people who are changing instead of people who are not. We make a big deal out of people who are changing so that it feels like more and more people are changing. Here's how many people chose to exercise. Here's how many people signed up for the no smoking program, right? So we want to normalize success rather than normalizing lack of success. In fact, with voter turnout, it turns out if we tell people that they need to vote because people aren't voting, that they're more likely not to vote because now not voting has become normalized. Whereas if you say, look, in record numbers people are getting involved, suddenly people are more likely to vote because they don't want to be left behind. Now, two more important things before I get to your questions. One is, it turns out that how we respond to people when they're making change and to ourselves also is a good predictor of change. Fascinating research around what happens when we praise people for results versus effort. And if you read my book, Stepping Up, there's a lot more detail on the research. But in the interest of time, let me simply say to you, what we know is that when we praise people only for results instead of for effort, they are more likely to keep trying even if they have not succeeded yet. And let's go back and connect some dots. If the average person who quits smoking tries 8 to 12 times seriously before they do, if Dean Ornish is right that shame and guilt wind up getting us to quit making changes in our health or in our life rather than facilitate them, it turns out that whenever we praise our own effort or the efforts of others, even if we're not successful, we make them more likely to have the grit to keep trying, even if they've only made a very little progress. Simple example. Let's say I'm trying to coach someone to speak up more at meetings, and they're still not doing it, but I can see they're trying. I'm much better off to say to them, you know what, Jack, I really have seen you trying to speak up more at meetings, and I want to encourage you to keep doing it. I really like it the other day when you spoke up in that meeting, versus saying, Jack, you're still not speaking up enough. I've been clocking you. It turns out that praising ourselves or others for effort instead of just results a very strong predictor of whether someone will stay at a task long enough to change their behavior. Here's some key things to think about, then I'm going to get to your questions. Obviously, a lot more we could talk about. Number one, it turns out simply writing down the change that you want to make a very good predictor of success. I told you we did a series of research studies where we had people identify 1 or 2 changes they wanted to make in their life, and then remember on a scale of 1 to 10, had to be at least a 9 before they left. And I told you only 2% changed who had no practice when they leave. What I didn't tell you is we had 2 other groups that we studied. The first group, we asked to set specific goals for themselves. I'm going to run 3 times a week. I'm going to eat breakfast every day. I'm going to start to speak up at meetings and be more assertive. I'm going to get out and meet 5 new people a week, whatever it is. And we said we'd like you to review those goals once a week for the next 3 months and just see how you're doing and make some changes based on it. The third group, we gave them index cards, and pocket-sized index cards, and we gave them multiple cards and said, we'd like you to just write down on that card a few words that remind you of the change you're trying to make in your life. I want to be more assertive. I want to connect more with people. I want to exercise more. I want to eat better, etc. And all we asked was, we'd like you to look at that card 10 to 12 times a day for the next 3 months, and you can make multiple cards if you want, 1 on your desk, 1 in your car, 1 in your bedside stand. All we want you to do is look at that card 10 to 12 times for the next 3 months. Now here's the fascinating thing. 3 months later, the people, remember, who had awareness and no practice, 2 out of every 100 had made any meaningful progress in the thing they said they were 9 out of 10 motivated to change. The people who had written goals for themselves, only about 12% had made any significant change. And the interesting thing is, what the goal-setting people said to us is the first couple of weeks it was okay, but after a couple of weeks I realized that I wasn't achieving my goals, so I started to beat myself up. And about 4 or 5 weeks in, I kind of gave up on most of the goals. But the card-carrying people, in the neighborhood of 60% of them, 60%, 6 out of every 10, who had actually done the technique of looking at the card 10 to 12 times a day, had made meaningful progress after a 3-month period. And it turns out that having the card in front of them meant they were just aware. They were going to take the elevator and they took the stairs. They were going to skip breakfast, but they saw the card in their bathroom. They were going to not speak up in a meeting, but they'd seen the card on their desk before they left. And the card apparently diminished most of the shame and blame. And in the third study, we teamed this with people connecting with at least one other person to be accountable to who was trying to make a change similar to those. And then we got an additional 16% of people. So now we were able to get up into the high 70s of people who had been able to make a change. So the bottom line is, write it down. Have someone you're accountable to. Checklists are nice things as well. Have a checklist of things you want to be aware of in your life. Develop a set of questions you want to ask yourself every day. And so the last thing I want to say is what the neuroscience says to us is that what the brain sees often, it sees as important. Let me say that again. What the brain sees often, it sees as important. What that means is simply the Ritz-Carlton, if I hear about customer service every day, if my leader is out there every day asking about customer service, if every day I look at that card or that checklist, I am more likely to make a change because whatever the brain sees as important, it is more likely to do. So I'm going to open it up now to questions. And by the way, if you'd like to connect with me, there's the Twitter hashtag, or go to our website and you can sign up for my bi-weekly video blogs. Let's turn it over now if you have some questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Izzo. So now we'd like to open it up for Q&A. You can go ahead and start submitting your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll start letting Dr. Izzo address those. So,
It's always hard to ask the first question. Pretend they've already done that. Who's got the second question?
No, we've got a bunch here. So Bill asks, he says, I work in health insurance. Many employers are making employees with bad behaviors, smoking, to pay a higher premium. he says this probably won't work. Your thoughts on that?
I do agree it probably won't work, especially in isolation. Meaning, remember, if awareness, drives very little change of behavior. My experience and the research suggests that without some disciplines for changing behavior, meaning social support, Keystone Habits, people, really identifying the benefits for themselves. So what I would say is that it's not necessarily a bad thing to do, but I don't think it's going to drive the kind of behavior change that you think it's going to without being teamed to other things. So one suggestion would be, if your company is intent on doing that, how about teaming it with, if you'll sign up for this behavior change program, we'll give you a temporary reprieve from that, and by the way, it'll also be good for you. So how about having a mechanism for them to sign up and an incentive to sign up for change? I think that would be more powerful than just the kind of penalty. Not saying no one will change because of that, but only the most ready.
Okay, perfect. And then we have another question. Anne asks, in organizations, change is usually instituted at the top. However, if an employee recognizes a need for change, how do you recommend bottom-up suggestion process?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the most successful organizations have that bottoms-up, process in place. And I really believe change can come from every level in an organization. So first of all, if I'm a leader, formal leaders or an organization trying to get people to step up with ideas. In my book, Stepping Up, we actually surveyed several thousand people. Why don't you step up more at work and take more initiative? Number one reason people said was leaders made decisions themselves and didn't ask for my opinion. Second, I did step up and bring my ideas, but my ideas were too easily dismissed. So as leaders, we have to really practice a very simple technique. As people bring us ideas, we say, thank you for caring, thank you for bringing ideas, tell me more. We have to explore ideas before defending. We have to see the merit without dismissing. And we have to more regularly, as the Ritz-Carlton does every single day, hardwire asking people for their opinion. And I think as individuals, we have to get better at speaking up and bringing our ideas constructively. And again, not promoting the book, but I think the book does have some specific things around constructive challenging. But one thing is, do I bring ideas and solutions, not just criticisms? Do I, instead of lay blame, take some responsibility for it? So first, we need to hardwire in asking people. Second, we have to speak up in a constructive way that makes people more likely to listen to us.
Okay. We have a great question. Carolyn says, our company is extremely client-driven. Often our employees' reviews often take a backseat as a result. What are your suggestions to hold managers accountable for timely reviews?
It's a really good question. My experience with performance reviews is that most leaders don't see the higher purpose in those reviews. And because of that, I believe they don't get to them because they really see it as a kind of organizational thing I got to check off, something the employee doesn't look forward to, neither do they. So two things I would do. One is and this is an important principle for change generally in organizations. We have to work with the why and the what more than we do with the how. Because remember, when a person is connected with the why and the what, they're more likely to do it. So we worry too much about what's the how of the performance review versus do leaders really know why this is important? Are they really with us on it? So I would start actually doing some sessions where you would be open and say, you know what, we've got a problem in the organization with people doing reviews. I think we should talk, let's have a conversation. Why does it matter that we do these reviews? I would do some focus groups of employees talking about what the reviews mean to them and why they're important, especially young people who take those reviews very seriously. And I would show those videos to leaders, send them out through the internal website, use them in leadership sessions, have the users, if you will, talk about why those reviews matter. Because once the leaders see the higher purpose in it, they're much more likely to do it than if it's just an organizational to-do. Remember, again, we're motivated more by the burning ambition than the burning platform. So by just telling people, look, we got to do it because it's, there's a bad thing's going to happen, not going to motivate people. Can we get them in touch with why this matters to do the reviews? And then ask them, what would make it easier for you to do the reviews? Because then, remember, people choose to change. What would make you more likely to do the reviews, and how can we help you?
Excellent. Well, we have some more questions. We will be gathering the remainder questions and letting Dr. Izzo follow up with those. Before we close today's webcast, I want to thank each and every one of you again for attending, and thank you, Dr. Izzo, for your time and great insight on this topic. Again, if you'd like the opportunity to sit in on Dr. Izzo and hear him speak live, he'll be presenting a keynote presentation at this year's Employer Healthcare and Benefits Congress and the World Medical Tourism and Global Healthcare Congress in D.C. September 20th through the 24th. We're expecting over 2,000 attendees, agents, brokers, consultants, employers. We have on-site networking where you can meet one-on-one with business prospects. Over 200 speakers and sessions and 3+ days of educational conference.
And this year, something new is we're having the general session in the exhibit hall. So both congresses will be having a big combined exhibit hall to maximize networking. And so right after Dr. Izzo gets everybody pumped up with his keynote, all the attendees will get to flow through and experience the exhibit hall as well. Dr. Izzo will also be signing books after his keynote presentation, so as people linger around and get their books from Dr. Izzo, they can also go and experience the networking in the exhibit hall.
And for the employers, agents, and brokers, the EHBC has a VIP program where we set aside a budget to help cover the expenses for you to attend the event and waive your registration fee.
We have a similar program with the World Medical Tourism Congress, bringing in buyers of healthcare from around the world. We're bringing in insurance agents, employers, referring physicians, government officials, all different people who are interested in sending their patients from all over the world, including we have buyers from Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia, Caribbean, all different areas of the world are coming to meet with people at this conference.
And one of the biggest things that sets us apart from other industry events are our leading employer case studies. Just a quick note, the Employer Healthcare and Benefits Congress, we have several different tracks: global benefits, wellness, which ties in very nicely with Dr. Izzo's keynote. We have several certification programs to help take your career to the next level. We provide SPHR recertification credits as well as continuing education for insurance professionals. And we get that approved in all 50 states. So what's new for the EHBC in 2014, we've got an entire track dedicated to corporate fitness and nutrition. Very big focus in this is how to change that behavior in regards to healthy eating and physical activity. We have new summits. We have one on, it's going to be a wearable device competition and think tank with an awards ceremony. We also have our first annual on-site clinics in the workplace forum and a day on the Hill. This year we're also pleased to announce 2 individual designations, one in corporate fitness and one in corporate nutrition.
At the World Medical Tourism Congress, we again have our Certified Medical Tourism Professional designation and Medical Tourism Marketing Professional programs. You can receive the core courses for the Certified Medical Tourism Professional live at the Congress, and then for both designations you can receive your continuing education for those of you who have already gone through the certification process. We also will have a track of sessions that will be approved for continuing medical education by the University of Miami. You can earn up to 10 credits. And then again, we'll be having a lot of our popular executive summits, including the Global Ministerial Summit, the Medical Directors Summit, the Global Medical Network Directors Summit, and the Medical Tourism Research Summit, bringing in the top people for those different industries. Every year we bring in a lot of the health ministries. In 2013, we had more than 80 ministers, vice ministers, attachés, and other dignitaries participated in our Congress, which is really exciting, and we expect even more government participation this year. Being in Washington, D.C., a lot of the embassies are sending representatives as well. Some exciting things that are new this year. We have the mHealth Congress. It's going to be open, that's going to be integrated with our agenda and open to all attendees. We have a Global Wellness Conference bringing in top professionals in the wellness travel and global wellness industry. And we're also having a dedicated track for the European Summit on cross-border healthcare, so talking specifically about different issues throughout Europe. Due to the great success of our forums last year, we're expanding more and more offerings for that to allow more attendees to participate. So we're having dedicated regional collaboration forums. So that's a roundtable discussion for people to participate and discuss certain specific issues in their region. So please fill out the form that's available online to request your seat, because there is limited seating available at these forums.
So again, don't miss out. As a thank you for attending today's webcast, we've got 2 different discount codes, our employer-free discount code and our non-employer, which is a 20% off. So visit either of the 2 websites for the congresses. And again, on behalf of the Employer Healthcare and Benefits Congress and the World Medical Tourism Congress, we'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining today's presentation. A special thanks to you, Dr. John Izzo. We're looking forward to seeing you in D.C. and looking forward to another great event. Thank you so much again for your time and sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us.